Okay, for today, we're going to talk about 1 Corinthians 7:4. Let me read it for us. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So let's start with how this has been misused. I'll maybe start, and you can tag on, because I'm sure it's been misused in many ways.
Sure.
But the way I've heard this is often to isolate one part of this, given whatever situation I'm in. So in my context, it was often about men being the head of the household. And so usually the first half of this verse was used, but not the second, which was the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does.
Right.
And then they leave off the second half of that, which is an obvious pulling out of context. But you were saying something earlier about maybe a different way that this is misused.
Well, and I just wonder, I mean, I have not been in a context where this has been misused, but I can imagine one where what Paul's talking about in this section is marital sex. And so if the husband owns the wife's body and the wife owns the husband's body, then it would stand to reason that either spouse could demand sex whenever they want it.
Right.
And it leads towards, well, you can't really say no since you don't own your own body.
Right. And in a patriarchal context where men tend to be more dominant and authoritative, it doesn't equal out that women are demanding sex equally as men are demanding sex.
Right.
It has tended to be men demanding sex from their wives in a non-consensual way based on this verse. So I think that's problematic, obviously.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I want to give Paul as much grace as I can here, because he really is being subversive to the culture. To have him say, it would be nothing for him to say, the wife doesn't own her own body, her husband does. Everybody knew that already. That's just the ancient context. But for him to go the other direction and say the husband doesn't own his own body, the wife does, he's doing some mutual stuff there, which I wouldn't expect from him.
Right.
And so I do want to give him credit, but I do think it's also important to point out that this leads in a direction of like no bodily autonomy, which isn't great. Now, what he's doing here is he's trying to thread this needle. He's writing to the church at Corinth, and they've got some folks there, which I've got no good terms for this, but let's just say they're very sexually liberal. We got the one dude that's sleeping with his mother-in-law. We've got the other guys that are like, I think we can see prostitutes, right, Paul? And he's like, no, none of that. Then here he's addressing the other side. He's got some other folks that are like, okay, Paul, so what I hear you saying is, it's best for a man not to touch a woman. That's what we get in 1 Corinthians 7:1. It's best if a man just doesn't touch a woman. And Paul's like, hold your horses. It's fine to do sex stuff. Just make sure that like you guys are agreeing and things like that. So he's not terrible, but I wouldn't use him as law here.
So what I'm hearing you say is that given Paul's context, he really is pushing the bounds toward more equality, more toward men and women both having authority in inverse ways, which would have been a profound statement. And yet, it's not maybe up to 21st century standards of consensual sex even within a marriage.
Right. And he'll go on from here to, I think, become a little bit more problematic even when he says, make sure in your marital relationship that you're not withholding yourselves from one another. Because if you do, the devil might get a foothold and your spouse will screw around on you. Can I say screw around on you?
Yes, of course. What's the context for that? Is that because I know how I would have interpreted it in my tradition would have been basically make sure that women, again, it's usually almost always women, make sure that you're giving enough sex to your husband because otherwise there will be a temptation for him to cheat on you. And if he does cheat on you, it's probably your fault because you did not have enough sex with him.
Yeah.
Is that the context that Paul is speaking into, or is it different?
No, he's not necessarily. He's mutual even here. He's not telling women to put out more frequently. He's telling both partners that they need to be sexually active. And again, he's trying to help the people that are like, we're not supposed to touch anybody, right? And he's like, no, there's a context for sex. But I do think that he goes a little too far because he's thinking in terms of these people needing sex or having some sort of a right to sex. And I just disagree. I just think he's wrong.
Oh, man. That's cut. No.
I respect what he's doing here. You know, he's trying to help people. He's a pastor. He wants to like lead them in the right direction. But I just think he kind of misses it here. With really good intentions.
Yeah.
I think that we need to advocate for people to have bodily autonomy. We don't own one another. And also saying that your spouse might be tempted by Satan if you're not putting out enough man or woman is also problematic. Your spouse doesn't have to have sex.
When if we zoom out, again, in the larger view of how we see what the Bible is and what it's trying to do, what I hear you saying is appropriate to say, good for you, Paul, for taking a step forward in the first century toward this trajectory that now we've actually gone beyond in the 21st century. And that's okay to say about the Bible. That maybe Paul doesn't have the last word on sexual ethics, but we can appreciate Paul for the trajectory. And maybe we can even follow in that trajectory and say, okay, it seems like he's moving toward an egalitarian, equal view of I have autonomy over my body, you have autonomy over your body. But we had to have some steps along the way. And maybe Paul is taking one of those steps, but it's okay to say Paul didn't get the whole way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's right on. But the passage goes on to talk about, he's doing something really unusual here. He really doesn't want anybody to get married.
Yep.
And so, which I love, because that even today is countercultural, right? Like, if you come up into a church and you're like, really, I'd rather that everybody could stay single. I mean, the moms' heads will roll. I can just see them be like, no, I want grandchildren. So for him to be like, I wish nobody got married. Also, young women, stay single if you can because you need to serve the Lord. That is extremely countercultural. I mean, today even, it's unusual for a young woman to remain single. But back then, you were expected to. And this ideology that he's promoting of like young women stay single, we hear about it a little bit in this text that's outside of the Bible, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, where this woman named Thecla takes Paul seriously. And she's like, all right, lit, I'm not going to get married. Forget you, fiance. And she runs off and starts preaching the gospel, and it takes everybody off. They're like, you're a woman, you're supposed to get married. So Paul is really ahead of his time here, but he's not quite where we are.
Right. Would it be fair to say, and this is just kind of how I've heard of this, is if we're talking about context here in 1 Corinthians, we can't talk about Paul without talking about this imminent, almost apocalyptic idea that Jesus will return very quickly. And so that's why within this context, that don't get married, don't do this, don't do that, because we're just really waiting for any day now. Jesus is going to be returning, and we have to have our sights set on the mission of God here and not these domestic things. So is that part of the context here in 1 Corinthians 2?
Yeah, he seems in this passage to be a pretty good evangelical, where he's like, we have one focus team. We are getting the gospel out there. And he even says, in light of the impending crisis. I don't know what that is. It might be Jesus' return. It might be something else. I don't know what he's thinking of. But he's advocating for people to have one focus and for that to be letting the world know about what Jesus has done.
Right. And I think the point, too, for me in all of these Disproving the Prooftext, too, is to see we can come to some conclusion that if given the crisis impending, given the first century, given this, then yes, all of these thoughts and commands and exhortations make sense.
Right.
But if those change, then the conclusions also change.
Yeah.
And since those things are no longer part of our context, the conclusions of these verses, maybe we need to rethink too.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think in light of the context of what we're dealing with here, on the one hand, the impending crisis, we don't know what that is, and we might not have that right in front of us. So if you want to get married, more power to you.
Right.
And similarly, if you're not living in that context where people are doing crazy sex stuff and then other people are doing no sex stuff, then you might not need Paul's help in being like a mutual relationship within marriage.
Yep.